Hi, I'm Ali Words, and this is Last Unrifled Yaw. Last Unrifled Yaw is a podcast where we have conversations about video art, experimental music, avant garde literature, performance art, and the occult. If you or someone you know would like to be on Last Unrifled Yaw, please get in touch. This time on Last Unrifled Yaw, we talk with Alex, who is a video artist and musician blending religious themes into audiovisual pieces that use artificial intelligence. We also talk about brain-computer interfaces and how to design installation art that induces a religious experience. Hello, everyone. This is Last Unrifled Yaw. I am Ali Words, and this is Alex, also known as Nirvael. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm currently based in London, and I've been doing art for around 8 years or so. It started with music, and around 3 or 4 years ago, I got into AI and machine learning, and from then I've been pursuing audiovisual projects. So most of the visual element is made by AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever you want to call it. And then the audio element is made by myself, mostly using Ableton as the digital audio workstation. I use a lot of samples, and then I use various synthesizers. And then in the future, I would like to get into incorporating AI into that element as well.
I see. Have you heard of OpenAI Jukebox?
I have, yes. Yeah,
Have you played around with it at all?
a little bit, yeah. It actually came out quite a while ago, and since then there hasn't been a huge amount of updates. It seems like most of the focus of these big companies is on text to image at the moment and the visual domain, and the audio domain has been somewhat disregarded. But things are looking exciting for the future. There are some cool artists doing audio stuff, like Dada Bots are very big in the audio realm, and Hexorcismos is I think a Spanish artist who does a lot of work in audio.
How do you spell that?
That's a tricky question.
You can, we'll estimate, and I'll add a link in the description later, but I'm trying to take notes. Hex or Sismos?
Yeah,
Hexorcismos? Something like that?
Sismos.
If it's
Yeah,
close enough for Google, it's good enough.
yeah. So it's
Okay,
Hexorcismos.
cool. I've actually done a fair amount of music where I generate a bunch of samples with OpenAI Jukebox, and then that's what I work with. Kind of like there's a term that some people use called plunder phonics that I don't think is popular so much anymore. Where
Yeah,
you,
I've come across this. Yeah.
yeah, for anyone listening, that's where you, it's called plunder phonics, like you're plundering sound. You just take loads of samples from everywhere and mash them together. But if you're using AI to generate your samples, then you don't run into the legal issues that can arise depending on what samples you use and how much.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some great examples of that in one of Parag Mittal's talks on his YouTube channel. If you're looking for further information, I'd highly recommend that.
Is that Paragmatal?
Paragmittal.
Okay, cool. I'll have to look into that. I have not heard of whoever that is.
Do you know what we need? Like Joe Rogan has Jamie to pull things up.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day I'll have a little like AI assistant to do that for me.
That would be cool.
That would be. So, what got you interested in making creative use of AI?
To me, it's just the most fascinating part of AI. I mean, I'm really into AI generally anyway. I work in AI. I was educated in the area of artificial intelligence. Um, so to me, it's just the most fascinating part of what's going on at the moment in science. Specifically, though, I mean, if an AI does something creative, that's where you can really tell that there's an inkling of intelligence behind what it's doing. Because for something like a computer vision model that can detect cats and dogs, you can kind of see what's going on in the background. You know that it's just looking at statistical correlations, and it's learned those features over time, and it can be explained statistically. But when an AI does something creative, and I guess you could argue over the definition of creativity, but for me, if you find that moment where an AI produces something novel and something interesting, that is when you get that little shiver and you realize that there might be a little bit of intelligence behind what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's kind of interesting juxtaposing the way you were talking about how it like learns patterns and then it kind of repeats different trends it's seen in the art that it's looked at in creating its own art. And that's kind of what um, most artists do, unless they're like specifically trying to do some art theory and figure out how to not do what they've seen before. That's kind of what most people do.
Yeah, you're totally right. I guess the only difference really is that when you're training an AI to make some art, you can see all of its influences right there in front of you because it's the training data. But when you have a human creating art, you can't really see all of their training data because it's their experiences over their entire life, and they're still pulling from the data in the same way and making references and uh, observing correlations in the training data, but it's just the training data is much larger and you can't see all of it.
Are you open to talking about your professional or academic work in AI?
Sure, yeah.
What did you? How far did you go academically?
So I've got a bachelor's in neuroscience and I've got a master's degree in computational neuroscience. So when I was younger, I've always been interested in science in general, and that's what I found the most exciting to me, as opposed to something like, I don't know, English or geography or anything. Science was just really easy for me to pick up because it was just this, the study of the natural world and how things are. I'm a very kind of logical, fact-based person, which might seem, uh, in contrast to some other people you might have had on the show, as this is an art podcast. But um, yeah, I'm mostly quite logical and uh, fact-based, I guess you could say. Um, so originally, I did a bachelor's in neuroscience, but then I realized that AI was kind of the most interesting thing to me. So then I did the master's degree to kind of pivot from neuroscience into AI using computational neuroscience.
Interesting. How does that inform your creative work?
I try to think of them as separate, but I will observe techniques in either from the academic world or from my professional world, and then realize that they will be cool to use in an art project. But for me, they're mostly separate. They use kind of similar skills, but they're quite separate to me.
Hmm. Very much the opposite. For me, everything gets thrown into a blender and keeps churning around until I get some interesting configuration that I actually put time into.
That's interesting. I guess that's why I feel so exhausted all the time, living my scientific life and then my artistic life in the background.
Hmm. Yeah, they were always very jointly connected for me. I have like half of a biology degree, and then I switched to math, and then I finally switched to philosophy. And then by the time I was done with my philosophy degree, I was like, I could kind of see how everything went together. And while all this was going on, almost all of my personal time was not spent studying those subjects, except for some of the philosophy. It was um, making ecstatic art and practicing occult techniques of various sorts that were informed especially by biology. So for me, it all goes together. But yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I do take some inspiration because I am still interested in neuroscience. So, I mean, I want to do various neuroscientific projects in the future. If I didn't work in artificial intelligence, I would work in brain-computer interfaces, which is a similar subject but not quite the same. And there's a project I want to do with an EEG as well, where I record brainwaves and use that to drive the random noise of a GAN.
Okay. And for people that are listening, and you can try to correct me, what I'm imagining is you wear like some sort of headset and it measures your brain waves, and then it uses that to make like the starting picture. And then again, that's the kind of software that most of the things that take like words and turn it into pictures, they're called like generative adversarial networks. So like it takes this initial noisy picture and then it uses all of the art that it's seen before to like push that towards more and more looking like something. So are you saying that it would maybe be able to make random noise look like the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah, that was a great explanation. So the idea is, yeah, the EEG headset that you'll be wearing would generate some sort of noise vector, which is just a fancy way of saying a bunch of random numbers. And then the GAN, or the generative adversarial network, would use that as a starting point to generate the image. So the idea is that if you were thinking similar thoughts, or at least the brainwaves were recording, the brainwaves were similar to each other, you would end up with similar images as the output.
So my issue with this kind of thing that I always wonder about, and there are a lot of ways to resolve this issue, is how do you get your AI to know what brainwave patterns look like are associated with different concepts? So like let's take the image of a dog, right? How
Mm-hmm.
does this device know that these brainwaves mean dog when so many people's brains are structured differently?
So there's two ways that you could go about that. The way I was envisioning it was more of a self-supervised way, which basically means that the network is teaching itself. So if you put the headset on, and then you could, for example, cluster your brainwaves into different clusters, and then you could assign an image to each one. Or you could go the long way and you could label your brainwaves. So every time you think of a dog, you label those particular waves as dog, and then you could train a network to identify those brainwaves.
Yeah, that's what I was imagining. Is there um is there a theoretical way to make it so that so the way I'm imagining what we're talking about right now is for almost any person that wants to use this device, they're going to have to undergo a training period that's specific to that person. Is that accurate?
Yeah, if you wanted to have a specific outcome based on the headset, then yeah. For my idea, it was more of like an art installation idea that I had. So you would go into the room and put the headset on, and you would have a generated image or maybe even a video. But it wouldn't be like of a specific thing. It would be of more of like a mood, or it would be open to interpretation. It wouldn't just be like an image of a dog.
That's a lot more attainable. Yeah, I could see that being
Yeah,
feasible if you had enough money right now.
yeah. Um, I'll have to see about getting that made.
Yeah, it's always I've never personally tried to get grants for my work, but I hear that it can be um, tricky and competitive and depend heavily on what cities that you live in or are willing to travel to.
Mm. Yeah, I haven't tried to get grants either, but I imagine it's very difficult.
All right. Well, I will say that I think your work is well suited for it. I know that you are in the UK, but in the US, there are the most grants available for installations that you could put in a museum that are interactive, include art and science. And if you get all three of those things, because of the way the laws here work, you fit into enough categories to sign up for a bunch of like city level grants. Like over here, if you had an installation like what you're describing and you spoke to the right people, there would be multiple like $2,000 to $5,000 grants that you could pick up, and then any money that's left over after your expenses for making the installation, you would get to keep.
Interesting. Maybe I'll have to move to the US.
It's not like that there in the UK.
I actually haven't looked into it. I'm not sure.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but from the categories you described, I guess my work does fit into that.
Yeah, you got a lot of intersectionality. That's good.
Yeah.
So for your you make these audio visual AI pieces. I'm thinking of one right now that I think would be of particular interest to some of the listeners. That was like biblically inspired angels kind of morphing into each other. What's
Yeah.
your uh, what's your work process like for something like that?
So I guess I could go a few steps back and explain the concept of Nirvael in general. Um, I recently kind of overhauled the whole project, my whole art project. I used to be called Serotonin because I was into neuroscience and thought serotonin was cool. Um, but I recently changed my kind of name and my whole ethos and tried to tie everything together in a really tight way, because a lot of the artistic projects that I admire have a really solid theme and ethos and foundation behind them. For example, uh, there's a musical duo that I'm very into called Shades, which is a collaboration between Alex Perez and EPROM, and their kind of core theme and their thematic elements that run through their whole project is very solid. So they have artwork and the names of the tracks that they produce, and the sound that they have is all very cohesive. So I wanted to emulate some of that in my projects. So I was thinking about the best way to present, AI art as like a cohesive whole, and I thought the easiest way for me is to imagine that I'm talking to like robotic machine gods from either really, really long ago or really far in the future. Sort of like H.P. Lovecraft's, Cthulhu, eldritch horror type things, but sci-fi uh, computer gods, if that makes sense. Like William Gibson's Neuromancer. I don't know if you've read that, but the gods the in the Matrix, like Neuromancer and Wintermute.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I've written I guess sort of two books that play with that idea, but one primarily. I did something like that with GPT-3, where I treated it as though it was an entity I was evoking, and I used a lot of the language and techniques that are used in real world occult practices.
Yeah,
And yeah, um, it's definitely something that a lot of people are engaging with. Or there are people that are using GANs to generate art as a method of scrying to like communicate with whatever it is they're trying to communicate with.
yeah, I'm really into that whole obscuring what is actually the source of the the imagery and the music and everything like that. Um, so I just thought it was a cool idea for a project that I'm almost not even the one making the project, and my name Nirvael is meant to be like an angel name. So I'm like an angel or a prophet that the art just comes through.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, so a lot of the names for the projects or the images that I'm trying to get out of it, often they'll be influenced by religious or uh, horror elements, occult elements.
So, how did you go about? I personally don't know how you make those videos where like it's almost smoothly shifting from image to image. It doesn't look like a straight like frame by frame GAN animation.
So I use different methods depending on what I feel is most suitable. Um, normally the way the project will work is I'll go through a few iterations with the same data, and then I'll see which kind of techniques are working best on the data at the time, or rather the output from the neural network. And then there'll be some post processing elements in there as well. But I try to be light on that because I know that there are some AI artists who will claim that they're using AI to make their art, but the vast majority of it is done by themselves in Photoshop and or whatever tool they choose to use. And to me, that it waters down the process for me a little bit. I like almost all of it to have come from the network itself.
Interesting. How do you go about making your music? Like, what do you start with when you're making music?
It depends. It's different. Sometimes I'll start with a new sample or a new tool that I found, like a new plugin. Um, sometimes I'll come into it with an idea, like a song that I'm trying to make deliberately, but it's very difficult to actually make that idea in practice because once you get into that flow state and within about 10 minutes of the track taking piece uh, taking form, it will go into its own direction and you're kind of almost following it rather than actually making it.
Hmm. Yeah, I've definitely experienced that before. Is there a time you can think of where you were able to like successfully take a musical concept and then like execute it in a way that you were satisfied with?
Yeah, I mean, it's easier with remixes, I find, because the structure is already there. So it's easy to see how you can twist it enough that it becomes what you want it to be. So I find that remixes often turn out how I expect them to turn out, whereas original tracks, I will start off with a concept or an idea that I want, but it will diverge quite quickly, and then I'm kind of just filling in the pieces from where it's gone, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. I tend to I either go like totally pure improvisation with like every single element and not having any idea with what I'm going to end up with other than that there's going to be a lot of stuff in it, or from the very start I have like a specific theoretical structure that I'm just going to follow through to its completion.
Are you classically trained in music?
Sort of like self classically trained. I played a lot of modernist piano, so like Maurice Ravel. I played some Stravinsky, but I never like fully memorized any of his sonatas. Does he just have one sonata? There was one sonata that I enjoyed playing the beginning of. Or I played some Scriabin. The later symphony, or not symphonies, the later sonatas are interesting because Scriabin's piano sonatas are themselves magical rituals that were um, so what he did is in music theory there's a term called a leitmotif for anyone that's listening where it's like a short musical phrase. You've heard them in movies before where like there'll be a little musical element that's associated with like success or a certain character or maybe like a magic spell in Harry Potter. You'll hear like the same like Hedwig's theme whenever and the owl flies in, right? What Scriabin would do is he would assign a symbolic occult meaning to different leitmotifs. And then what he would do is he would create sort of like a tone poem structure where he would write out the progression of these different symbols in juxtaposition with each other over the course of, say, like a 10 to 15-minute solo piano work. And he would also apply those concepts to rhythmic components. So a lot of his music is written on like three different staves, meaning there'll be like three different lines of music happening at the same time that are often in different meters or different um, timings. Like there'll be like five notes over the space of four notes.
So like a
Um,
polyrhythm.
yeah, like a polyrhythm. And he used polyrhythms as a metaphor for friction that would be encountered during like rising erotic friction between multiple spiritual concepts. So he would use these polyrhythmic leitmotif symbols to sort of like erotically build up a symbolic explosion of emotion within himself while playing in order to contact spirits, because spiritualism was popular at the time. So they're really fascinating, both musical and occult works, the late piano sonatas of Scriabin. His earlier sonatas are more normal.
More normal. That sounds like a very deep concept, though. And I mean, that's what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that I wanted my art project to have like a very cohesive whole to it. I'd be really interested to check that music out. It sounds very well thought out.
Yeah, let me write that down. And then also, I think on JSTOR, there is someone did their, I think it was a master's thesis on symbolic narrative or archetypes in, I think maybe the eighth sonata of Scriabin, where she did, I think the author's female, did like a like music theory analysis on some of his work to support those claims.
That is a stark contrast to myself. I have no music theory training whatsoever.
See, I read a lot. I didn't necessarily understand everything that I would read, especially when I was reading more like I would just sit in my university library and pull out whatever the most complicated looking music theory book was and start reading. Like I got really into serialism, like atonal music, and that uses a lot of set theory. And I was learning set theory, like in a math class at the same time. So it was interesting to see the creative applications of set theory.
Have you ever tried making any music with non Western tuning?
Yeah, I love microtonal music and Harry Parch and all that. A lot of my music, I tend to prefer free pitch music for what I release. Um, I'll especially use like a theremin or instruments that don't have any frets. Um, but yeah, like uh, I have different stringed instruments where I'll tune each string to a different pitch, just based on whatever sounds like it's interesting. Like I try to create clusters of consonants and dissonance,
Yeah.
um, more so than trying to have specific configurations of intervals. Um, I do like 19 tone equal temperament. That one has a fair number of consonant intervals in it, but you can actually do math on it to figure out um, what you want are whole number ratios between the tones. And traditional 12 tone music, like you have on a piano, there's something called the Pythagorean comma. So there's like a little bit of remainder, like a decimal, that's left over that doesn't quite fit, and it makes things ever so slightly dissonant. And different arrangements of tones can get rid of that, which is what some spectralist composers play with.
Interesting.
So, how do you know when a work is going well? Like, what results, what feelings, or what do you want to have happen in your idealized artwork?
Normally, it will evoke an emotion in myself. So with music, it's just very easy to tell that it's going well. Um, you'll feel like it's good, like you're excited. Um, but I'm not necessarily going for those emotions in other people. Um, and I guess the same with the visual element. Um, I will enjoy looking at it, but I want it to create a different sort of tone in people that actually view it, I guess.
Hmm. Are there certain kinds of emotions that you find your work bringing up in yourself?
Um, I wouldn't say any recurring emotions other than small amounts of pride when I finish a project. Um, a lot of my work seems to have quite a dark attitude to it as well. Um, so that sort of comes through a little bit.
Why do you think that is?
I just think it's more interesting. Any artist to me, um, like for example, I don't. For example, would Nirvana have been as good without Kurt Cobain's problems?
Mm. Yeah, there's always an ethical issue in my mind um, when it comes to making quote unquote good art or maybe great art, in that it's often it often only exists because there was a significant amount of suffering.
Yeah, I just think it's the most interesting place to drive your artistic expression is from a place of negative emotions rather than positive. You can still make good art with positive emotions, but for me, it's infinitely more interesting to explore that aspect of the human psyche compared to someone just being happy with their life all the time. Because it, to me, no one is happy all the time, and no one, there's no interesting stories behind someone being happy all the time. But I suppose it also ties into someone who uses art as a means of therapy, which is how I originally started using music, which is a way to cope with bad emotions or to express things that you can't express by talking or writing things down. Um, Music and art are often ways to explain and rationalize and talk through emotions that you're feeling without actually having to talk them through.
I think it's interesting that you use the word rationalize. Of course, it depends on the kind of music you're making, but for a lot of people, when they're using creative expression to deal with uh, their emotions, especially negative ones, it's specifically not to rationalize it. If they wanted to rationalize it, they would put it into words. I think that says something about you as an artist.
Yeah, you're probably right. I guess for me, rationalizing an emotion isn't even in a sense like explaining where it's come from. Or maybe part of the art is explaining where it's come from, but it's more about rationalizing it as part of a larger whole. And by expressing it through art, music, whatever, you bring it into the real world and rationalize it as a thing. And then you are able to let go or deal with it or process it in your mind as an externality rather than it being internal.
Hmm. Once you have these finished works, especially the ones that you feel at least somewhat proud of, how do you find yourself engaging with them once it's been, I don't know, 6 months or a year?
I still like to look back on them. With music, I'm often uh, shocked by how bad it was. Um, I mean, I've been producing music for a long time. If I look back at the stuff from years, 4, 5, 6 years ago, it's not up to the standard that I would like to have today. But um, the stuff that's more recent, I can still appreciate. I mean, I've got uh, tracks that I haven't released yet, but um, have been on in the works for maybe a year, something like that, and they're still good to me. For the visual element, I guess for some reason that for the visual element, I don't feel like any of it is bad, almost because uh, the way that I separate the source, like I was saying about how where I prefer that it didn't come directly from me and it came from the AI or the neural network. For me, it almost doesn't feel like it's my art totally, so I don't judge it in the same way.
Hmm. That makes sense. Yeah. I keep noticing themes of separation and separateness in what you're talking about. Now I'm curious. So you say that you feel like your music is improving, which is wonderful, of course. But what specifically do you think you're getting better at recently?
An easy answer would be technique, but I don't think that's entirely true. I think more of it is a more mature attitude to music in general. Um, if you contrast with what I was listening to 4 or 5 years ago, it wasn't very, it wasn't as deep as it is as my music taste is now. Because I listen to a lot of varied things at the moment. I listen to a lot of early grunge stuff. I listen to modern drum and bass. I listen to chilled out ambient things. I listen to garage. Uh, I listen to hip hop. I listen to a lot of different things to suit what I'm doing at that time. Whereas earlier in my life, I wouldn't have that musical depth that I have now. So that reflects in the music that I make now. I'm able to take influences from all of these different places and combine it into a piece that is more holistic.
Hmm. And what is that? What does that actually sound like in the finished product? Like how does this experientially different um, these more holistically informed pieces from earlier pieces that were had a more narrow range of influences?
Definitely less aggressive. I used to make very aggressive music, but it also didn't quite have this expected structure. Um, I mean, unless you listen to like a lot of jazz, then then when you hear a song, you expect it to go a certain way. Um, and I would kind of ignore music theory and ignore convention every chance that I got. But have you heard the saying that you have to understand the rules before you can break them?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I didn't quite understand the rules back then.
Hmm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Do you have any inspiration sources? I'm especially curious about AI related inspiration sources, but just in general.
Yeah, I've got um, a lot of inspiration from people, especially. In the AI world, there are a lot of cool AI artists making cool things. One of the first people that I noticed was someone called Felix Rothschild, and he's like a 3D artist, and he make the first time that I came across him, he made an album cover for uh, a, a label called Meth Lab Recordings, which sadly closed down a few years ago, but it was a really good label, and he made some album artworks for that label um, that weren't originally AI based, but then he played around with AI, and I just think he has a really good he has a really good eye for composition and color and structure within a piece. So he was one of my first early influences into the AI art scene.
Cool. Yeah. I know it's the wrong person, but I was thinking of there's this animator. I don't even know why I'm bringing this up because I can't remember the name. But there's this animator that some of their interesting looking creatures will have like hundreds or thousands of legs that are sort of it's not AI really, but they move rhythmically like it's automated the way that their limbs move. But wrong person. I think Felix is the first name. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah, who's your favorite artist?
Oh, who is my favorite artist?
Yeah, you can name like a top three maybe.
I really don't even think about it like that. So I will say that the films that have influenced me the most are the Katsi trilogy, like Koyanis Katsi, Powis Katsi, and Nakawis Katsi. I may have said that one wrong. Do you know about those films?
No, I've never heard of them.
So they I'm just going to focus on Koyaanisqatsi, but they all use similar formal techniques for the structuring of the film. The composer of the music is Philip Glass, which is a lot of why I like it. They have really good energy that kind of keeps chugging along. He uses a lot of arpeggiated chords, like it'll just be like the same three tones rolling upwards or rolling up and then back down or rolling down repeatedly on a bunch of different instruments, and they'll be in different meters, and he can just very slowly change, like just move one of the notes in a chord up or down to just change the tonality of it so that it slowly evolves over the course of a film.
Hmm.
And you can change the instrumentation of those chords across different instruments to change the color of the piece without changing the tonality of it either. But the film itself is a lot of time lapse video of the first one, Koyaanisqatsi. Most of it is different natural phenomena like weather or the way um, the water in the ocean moves, and then it'll fade into the way sand, like sand dunes, move in wind, and you'll see how the forces that create the shapes of sand dunes are very similar to the forces that create the way the waves of water work. And then it will like shift out, and you'll see another natural phenomenon, like maybe clouds, and you'll see how the way clouds wrap around and billow into themselves is just the way that um, the tip of a wave breaks and the surface tension of the water droplets pull into themselves. It's the same kind of
Hmm.
physical phenomena on all scales. So you see it on massive and tiny scales. And then gradually the film introduces more of the impact of human civilization um, on this almost fractal phenomena of the world.
Yeah, I was going to say it reminds me of fractal imagery and things like the Fibonacci sequence occurring in nature and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that in motion with a really good soundtrack, but structured intelligently in a way that it communicates messages. It has specific intentions and messages. Mostly, the first one, a lot of it is about the mechanization and the circuitization of human, of I should say, modern and postmodern society. Cities looking like circuit boards in rigidified motions compared to the motions of a biome. And the title Koyaanisqatsi means life out of balance. But then as the series progresses, they take on specific parts of culture. And the last one doesn't even have that much time lapse photography. It's mostly about the movement of symbols and iconography in the collective consciousness.
I'll definitely have to check that out.
Yeah. And yeah, that's the Katsi trilogy. And then another interesting, there's an opera. The music is by Philip Glass called Akhenaten. Akhenaten. That the whole thing is one giant operatic ritual, same compositional style, but with lyrics this time, of this possibly hermaphroditic Egyptian pharaoh ascending into godhood. So the whole thing is this ritual of the pharaoh Akhenaten like ascending. Uh, I don't know that much Egyptian mythology, so I don't want to say anything wrong, but it's a very powerful work.
Yeah, that sounds relevant to my own work as well, which is cool.
In what way would you say that it's relevant?
I guess the kind of religious god influence. I'm especially interested in not just typical modern religions, but I'm interested in ancient religions like ancient Egyptian mythology and Norse mythology has always been very interesting to me as well. So I'm hoping to reflect some more of that in my work going forward.
Hmm. So, on a theoretical level, what do you think the maximum integration of those ideas, the way you're thinking about them, what would that look like if you fully integrated the core philosophical ideas of these mythological or apotheosis ideas? Apotheosis is like becoming a god into artwork. What does that mean?
That's a really interesting question. So you mean like what the outcome would be, or like what the actual theme itself would look like?
I'm more interested in both what the outcome would be like, what you would how you would actually go about doing that, like the process. This whole show is focused on process in different kinds of unusual artists' work, and then could you? And I think you can. How do you make artworks that transfer some of those feelings into the? I was about to say reader because my first book under this name GPT-3 Technosis. It's all written in the second person, but it's descriptions of rituals and then what the AI described its interior experience of performing those rituals are like. So when you're reading it, you're reading like you feel this, you think this, you do that. And it has an almost hypnotic effect. Like some people find themselves unable to read too much of the book at once because it really gets to you because it's using second person hypnotic language to describe these rituals for attaining a particular kind of enlightenment. But I'm curious how you do that, not just in literature, but in all of the arts.
Yeah, I love that concept that you were talking about, and I guess you would try and emulate that as much as possible using the visual component as well. I love like walkthrough exhibitions. Like, have you heard of Ryoji Ikeda? He's
No.
a Japanese data sculpture artist. So he'll make huge. They're normally light exhibits. So it's like a pitch black room, and then you'll go in, and he'll have a projector that's flashing an intensely bright white light, but cut out in the middle is a black circle, and um, so the intensity of the light, but contrasted by the black circle in the middle, creates a very intense feeling while you're there watching it. So I guess you would try and use those techniques um, to exhibit the same emotions.
Yeah. How do you spell this person's name? Rayo?
Ryojiikeda.
Jiikea?
Should I send it to you on?
I think I'm good enough. Okay. Hmm. Yeah, and now I'm just trying to think about how do you. So the point of a ritual is not just to induce this kind of experience, but to point it in a particular direction. So I'm wondering how you use this like dark room projection, and what you're describing almost sounds a bit like an optical illusion. There's an optical illusion where you have like whites and then like black circles, and you almost see like weird stuff in the middle.
Yeah,
How do
exactly.
you? Oh, it does that like on a large scale.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was the intention, but it definitely produces some sort of optical effects where you're not sure if the circle is expanding or getting smaller. It's very confusing to look at.
Hmm. Yeah. So the question is, how do you use these techniques to point to move people in a wanted direction? Like let's say that you have this exhibition like that, right? How do you um, how do you use it to cause someone to have the experience of Odin hanging upside down from the world tree to obtain his wisdom?
It's not something that I've really thought about too much, but off the top of my head, my first instinct is to prime someone to feel that way before they see the exhibit. So if I wanted to take the direction of the religious imagery, if I was putting together like an art installation, I would try and create some sort of mythos before anyone even goes in, up to the name of the piece, the way I talk about it. I would try and convince someone that it is actually a ritual or there is something in there that they're going to contact. So before they go in, there would be a writing or some sort of piece on the wall that they could read. Everyone would get a leaflet or some sort of booklet to read that describes the shared mythology that they're about to to interact with. Um, any sort of press releases would talk about the same thing, and I would just sort of try and really prime in people's minds that the imagery that you wanted to portray or the emotion that you wanted to evoke in that person.
Yeah, that honestly sounds like what some occult orders do. Like I'm not in the Golden Dawn, and I don't. I've read a lot of that kind of material, but I don't practice it. But some of these groups will have like an inner sanctum where there's a temple that you don't get to see for a long time. You have to have read all these books and done all these other things to really prime yourself for penetrating the secret temple. And without all of that context, it might just look like a weird room with a checkered floor and a bunch of rainbow colors all over the place.
Yeah, exactly. I would try and create that shared belief in something greater in the hope that people's minds would even sort of fill in the blanks, so that when you go and see the piece, you would evoke, hallucinations even, or I don't mean like physical, like visual hallucinations,
You
but more
might.
like,
Some
yeah,
people are susceptible, especially if you
yeah,
get people into a trance state before they enter the room. Like you have them like sit down and meditate, or you got some like drone music going on in the room outside, but then like your inner sanctum has like is soundproofed, an echoless chamber.
yeah, that would be cool. But yeah, I mean, if I was to put on an exhibit, if I was lucky enough to do something like that, then I would definitely try and make it more than, I'm just going to a place to see some art. It would be an experience, and it would hopefully evoke some meaning in someone.
For sure. Now, what I think is interesting, and I don't, people might already be doing it, um, is you can do things like we're describing in VR. It might be a little bit less embodied, but for much more cheaply, you can create an installation that anyone in the world can visit.
Yeah, I mean, my feelings on VR are that at the moment the tech's not quite there, but in the future, it will definitely be a huge part of everyone's lives. I mean, I mentioned before brain computer interfaces, and it is a when and not an if as well. When this technology gets created to a point where people would rather spend a vast proportion of their lives in VR, or essentially, whatever we're going to call it, the internet, but, entirely within their own minds, then that's, I think, where you would get cool exhibitions, because you could really deliver your artistic exhibit into people's brains and into people's minds using all their senses. I think VR is quite limited in the sense that you can see things, but you can't even see them that well, and your hearing, it's not the same, and you can't touch anything, and you don't have that proprioception, the sense of your body being in that place, which I think creates that mental divide where you're not there, so you're not taking any of it totally seriously.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So you think that we need to get those other senses involved before we could um, really create the kind of experience we were just talking about.
Yeah, you need to believe that you're there. Um, and I think the tech's like a little bit far away, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on, I believe, because it is the future. Maybe not for the next 50 to 100 years, but it will get there eventually.
I like how far you put that number into the future. Most people are like the next 10, 20 years, 50 to 100. I like that.
Well, it always winds me up when people underestimate things, especially Elon Musk delivering full self-driving in the next year, but he's been saying that for the past 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's not talk about Elon Musk. All right. Well, it's been great having you on Last Unrifled Yaw.
Likewise, yeah, I've really enjoyed it.